Personal identity. Who do you think you are? This is our next metaphysical problem, right? Classic philosophical problem. So let's get some distinctions and definitions out of the way before we get into the problem. Let's talk about personhood for a moment, right? So there's a human being. So human being is not considered a person in philosophy. It's a biological concept instead, right? It's the class of creatures to which we belong. But a person, although still a matter of controversy, is commonly thought of as having rationality, command of language, self-consciousness, control or agency, and morality, moral worth or title to respect. And those are all embodied within a single human being. Remember, what we're doing is looking at philosophical distinctions, right? So let's talk about identity, your personal identity, right? When you think of who do you think you are, right? If somebody asks you that question, the dreaded interview question, who is blah, blah, blah? Who are you? Tell us about yourself. They're asking you to tell them about your identity. So you typically will start answering that question in terms of, let's say, your friends, who your friends are, your family, your relationships, what kind of work you usually do, and your hobbies, your practices and habits, what your ethnicity is, something about your appearance maybe, the things that you believe, what you value, what you choose, what you've created. All of these are ways that you answer the question, who are you? You answer it very often in terms of all of these different criteria. Right? Let's look at some other terminology. So numerical identity is strictly defined as a single unique thing. It's a spatial temporal identity, right? Something can be numerically identical only to itself. It's one of a kind. It takes up a certain space at a certain time, and nothing else can be that thing, for instance. Qualitative identity is different, right? Something that looks, feels, and tastes identical, right? So you can have two plates of nachos that are exactly the same. They're not numerically identical, but they look, feel, and taste identically the same. So that's different from numerical identity. Nachos. Essential properties. So now we're looking at properties, just again, more terminology surrounding this issue. An essential property or properties are the properties that make the thing what it is, and that's required for numerical identity. So for instance, think of, if you thought of a common beach ball, right? A beach ball might have the essential properties of being spherical and being, inflated, right? Those, and amongst other properties, but those two properties are essential to the thing being a beach ball, right? If it was triangular and made of cement, you wouldn't call it a beach ball, right? But then there are also accidental properties. And those can change without affecting numerical identity or essential properties for that matter. So to use the beach ball example, what's essential to something being a beach ball is that it's spherical and that it's inflated, for instance, right? But an accidental property would be like, okay, it's red, okay, or it's blue, right? Those blueness or redness, or it has pictures on it, cartoons on it, right? Those are accidental properties. Those can change without affecting the beach ballness of the thing. Okay, so now that we got the terminology out of the way, let's look at the problem of personal identity. So far, we've looked at the mind-body problem in metaphysics. Now we're looking at the problem of personal identity and what sort of questions that problem brings up. So this much we know. Physical objects persist as entities through time and through change, right? You put your book down on the counter at night, you wake up, and it's out there again in the morning. For instance, a very mundane example, right? Though not through all changes, right? Some change is radical enough to destroy the object. You could light it on fire and it's going to be gone, for instance. But physical objects do this. They persist throughout time and through change. Like your body, too, right? Same is true of human beings. And same is true of persons, particularly, right? In virtue of what exactly is person A considered at time 1 identical to person A considered at a later time 2? Now you got to pose this question to yourself in a more familiar manner, right? Right now, wherever you're sitting, you'll say, yes, I'm the same person that I was 5 years ago. Right? Some things have changed, but I'm the same person, right? The question of, and the problem of personal identity asks, by virtue of what? What exactly makes you the same person? How can we delineate that sameness? How can we delineate that identity? So first question, and many people, it's intuitive to just answer, well, I've got the same body. I see a scar that I got 5 years ago, and it's still there. And I recognize all the features of my physical body, right? I'm the same body or substance or matter, right? That's how I know I'm the same person today as I was 5 years ago. It's by that virtue, right? So for, you got Drew Barrymore throughout different phases. That's Drew Barrymore, and so is that, right? It's because you're in a continuous body. Some people will answer, that's how I know I'm identical to the same person that I was 5 years ago, right? The classic problem posed to body theory of personal identity is Theseus's ship. And Theseus was the founder of Athens, or the mythological founder of Athens, and he had this ship, right? And so let's imagine that ancient Athenians put Theseus's old wooden ship into a museum, right? And this is a thought experiment. So as time goes by in this museum, the planks gradually begin to rot one by one. And as they do so, they're replaced by new ones, right? Eventually, until all of them are replaced. Would this still be Theseus's ship? Now, if you're thinking in terms of, who has the deed, or what does the placard in front of the ship in the museum say, then you're thinking about it wrongly, right? Would you still consider, if every single plank has been replaced, is this still Theseus's ship? Or is it a replica? Right? Now, imagine that each of those old planks that were rotting, right, and gradually being replaced, imagine that somebody had taken them and put them like in storage, right, in a warehouse. They were saved in a warehouse and reassembled into another ship with a qualitatively identical form. Now, which of the ships would be Theseus's ship? Would it be the one that's in the museum that's been gradually refurbished, if you will, or would it be the one that's been reconstructed in the same exact form in the warehouse, right? And then you can push this further and say, what if some mistakes were made in the reassembly of the original ship or the warehouse ship, and the form was qualitatively different? Or what if you gradually swapped the original planks, right, in the boat in the museum, the ship in the museum, for plastic ones, right? Would the one in the museum still be Theseus's ship? Hopefully you can see what this thought experiment is meant to illustrate. But again, what's the point here, and how is this relevant to our purposes here? Well, within the span of 7 years, approximately, every cell of your body dies and is replaced. It's known as apoptosis or PCD, which is programmed cell death. So you literally are not the same person you once were. Your cells, everything that comprises you, it's died and been replaced by new cells. So if this is the case, where does our identity lie? Can it possibly lie in our body? In other words, right? So then here comes an answer to that, right? Provided by Descartes. Well, is it continuity of some mind, soul, or ego that occupies us? Right? So if Descartes' mind-body dualism is correct, then the answer to the question of personal identity is simple. The self, or your identity, who you are, the personal self, at time 1 is the same as the self at time 2, as long as time 2's body is animated by the same Cartesian mind, soul, ego as was time 1's body. Right? The self is a kind of permanent soul substance. And this is consistent with what we've learned about Descartes. Correct? So you're the same person you were you are the same person that you were 5 years ago today, as long as you've got that same mind, soul, ego stuff in you. And that's supposed to account for identity over time. So a problem with that ego soul stuff theory is that the Cartesian theory presupposes that Cartesian minds or souls themselves persist through time and change. But what makes the Cartesian mind or soul at time 1 identical with the Cartesian mind or soul at time 2? Clearly, our minds have different properties throughout the course of our lives. Clearly, you've learned more and added more to your mind and experienced more throughout the past 5 years. Right? So we don't have the kind of identity we're looking at. That still begs the question, what makes us the same person today as we were 5 years ago? Right? It doesn't seem like it can just lie in some soul substance or mind or mental stuff, because that's changed radically in the last 5 years. So here's somebody else up at bat. It's Locke, right? Is it continuity of consciousness, right? This is known as memory theory. The memory theory of personal identity states that the self at time 1, or 5 years ago, let's say, is identical with the self at time 2, like present, if and only if the self at time 2 remembers experiencing events from self at time 1's life, right? If there's a causal chain of memories, in a sense, if you can say, well, I can remember that I was the same self yesterday, and then I can remember it back and back and back, and that you can connect the dots, even if it takes a long time, or theoretically, you can connect those dots in memory, Locke would say, then this is, by that token, you know that you're the same person today as you were 5 years ago. Right? So personal identity is not to be found in some soul substance like Descartes would have it, but in consciousness, where consciousness is the repeated self-identification of oneself over time. And personal identity is a matter of psychological continuity, being aware of oneself existing over time. So you are a connected thread of overlapping psychological states, or memory links, as he would have it. That's his account. But of course, there are some problems with memory theory. So if the memory theory of personal identity is correct, that would mean that none of us really became who we are until our first memory, which generally doesn't occur until about age 3, and that's known as childhood amnesia. I mean, if you were to look back, usually when I ask this in classes, students can remember what their first memory was, and it's usually just kind of like an image. The first thing that really took. So if memory theory is correct, then we aren't really who we are until that time. So what were we prior to then? We weren't the same person, right? This doesn't seem satisfactory. This view also requires that those who lose their memories are no longer the same person, because that psychological continuity is broken, right? If you got into some tragic accident and you woke up and you had no memory of who you were, for instance, and you didn't recognize your boyfriend, girlfriend, mother, father, where you work, you don't even know what you're doing there in the hospital. This happens to people. But I mean, for outsiders, you're still going to look at this person and say, this is the same person, but something's changed, and that person is going to have a sense of identity of some sort, even if they can't remember, quote unquote, who they were prior to this, right? So this account is somewhat unsatisfactory as well. There are problems with this account of personal identity. And then what about false memories, for that matter? Psychologists have found that our recollection of everyday events may not be as dependable as we'd believe. Moreover, even once information has been committed to memory, it can be altered. We've seen this. We've seen TV shows on this. Our recollection of memories can be manipulated, and even entire sets of events can be confabulated. So this doesn't seem a good guarantor of personal identity over time. The memory theory has its flaws. Or how about this one then? Another answer, another stab at it. Are you just a bundle of internal experiences? Should we loosen up, in other words, our sense, our definition of personal identity? Let's look at what Hume had to say on this. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or another of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I can never catch myself at any time without a perception, and can never observe anything but the perception. And if you were to do what he is, claiming that he did, right, look intimately into what you call yourself, I think you might find that he's right. You're not just going to find some bare self in there that kind of holds all of these properties, right? It's always going to be a perception with some content. It could be a memory. It could be an emotion, right? But you can't look into yourself and say, oh, there I am, without attaching all of these experiences to it, right? So should we just call you a bundle of internal experiences, right? That there's no real inner you or your true self that withstands the test of time. It's a constant shift in every imaginable, at every imaginable stage, right? I just mentioned these. So is there also a further awareness of the self as such, or the I, apart from the awareness of those thoughts and feelings? And Hume said no. True to his philosophy, he thought that the concept should be committed to the flames and rethought. This concept of an enduring inner self that persists through time and change needs to be thrown into the fire and burnt up and reconfigured. So rather, we're a bundle of internal experiences related only by resemblance, succession, and causation. So when we refer to ourselves as I or inner self, it's just a way that we name this bundle, right? When you're referring to yourself and you say, I feel this, I feel that, or I think that this I is just meant to be a shorthand of referring to all of these bundles over time that you couldn't possibly express in a snap, right? Or in any given situation. It's just a convenient way to referring to an ever-shifting possibly evolving, possibly devolving, whatever the case might be, like locus of experience. And to begin to close this lecture down, we've got a few people who vehemently, or at least this fellow, vehemently disagreed with Hume. His name was Thomas Reid. He was a Scottish philosopher and contemporary of Hume, who, to sum it up, said, I am not thought, I am not action, I am not feeling, I am something which thinks and acts and feels. So he's just denying everything that Hume said. If Hume would say, this is all you are, is a collection of thoughts, actions, and feelings united throughout time and kind of bundled up, there is no I underlying that. Thomas Reid said, no, there is something in there that thinks and that acts and that feels. Something else I wanted to mention is Peter Singer, who's a contemporary moral philosopher, says, well, if certain animals have the same features that suffice for humans being persons, then we ought to consider them persons also. So there are myriad implications of the solution you choose for the problem of personal identity, and there's other paths to go down once you start cracking this nut open. And this one has to do with how you define personhood, right? So if you're going to define personhood with a set of characteristics, what Peter Singer is saying is that if certain animals have those characteristics as well, then that's sufficient to call them persons as well. And so perhaps apes, dolphins, and even elephants could qualify as persons depending on how you define them. And if that's the case, would we then have moral obligations to those things? So I'm just kind of filling in a few other tangential aspects of this problem of personal identity. Now, why does this matter, all of this? So the problem of personal identity is about self-conceptualization. It's about who do you think you are? And the way that you think about and define yourself, it contributes immensely to what you experience and how you live in the present and the future, right? So I'm sure all of you know somebody who calls themselves, oh, I'm not a dog person, I'm a cat person, or I'm not a cat person, I'm a dog person, right? That's an act of self-definition. And that contributes to the way that you experience the world. If you cling very heavily to that aspect of your self-definition, I'm a dog person, it often implies, then I don't like cats. It often contributes to the way that you not just treat cats, but the way that you perceive them in the world. It colors your experience, right? If you define yourself through what kind of music you like, it tends to tune out other kinds of music. I'm not saying necessarily does, right? But if you're younger and you define yourself as, I can remember in my days, like as a rocker, right? Then you wouldn't be caught dead listening to hip hop. You wouldn't be caught dead listening to R&B, for instance, because you're a rocker, right? Same goes for any sorts of lifestyles. Political parties. Sure, you can fill in the blanks here. If it's a massive part of your identity that you're a Republican or a Democrat or a conservative, liberal, libertarian, if this is something you cling to as part of your personal identity, then it's going to color the way that you look at everything else. Same with fears and phobias. And so this is why the problem of personal identity matters, right? If you can if you can think of yourself, I'm a proponent personally of bundle theory, right? That this is all constantly in flux. And that our personhood doesn't have any essential attributes, right? But if you think that you do that. If you believe along with Descartes, for instance, or even Locke and his memory theory, for instance, then you might start to think that there are essential properties to your identity. And you might start to think that your political affiliation is an essential part of your identity, or your musical tastes are an essential part of your identity. Right? That's not allowed under bundle theory. There is no essence there. So identifications like these can become dominant in your mind and act as filters of experience. So do with that what you will. Right? And there are also implications of this problem, right? They're myriad, but they include the practical, right? Personal relationships and promises into the future. The personal identity theory that you subscribe to can affect what you think about, contracts into the future, your relationships and the promises that you make, your marriage. Say, I promise to love and honor you till death do we part. If you're a strict bundle theorist, that's not really going to go over so well, right? Death penalty, crimes and punishment in general, legal obligations, contracts. I've already mentioned, do we have moral obligations to some non-human animals? Those are some implications of where you stand on the personal identity issue. Also, the religious and the spiritual, right? Do you have a soul or spirit that's going to go on after death? Well, the way that whichever theory of personal identity you subscribe to logically indicates where you ought to go as far as these issues are concerned. And free will, which we'll study next time.